In the history of war, there were armies that did not lose to the enemy. They lost because they ran out of food. When an army marches hundreds of miles, day after day, carrying weapons, armor, and their own lives on their backs, the greatest threat is not the enemy's blade. It is hunger. Yet there was one thing that followed soldiers through those long, exhausting marches. Not a sword, not a shield, but a block of hard cheese. Something ordinary, something overlooked. And yet, this simple food decided whether an army kept moving forward or fell apart before the battle even began. Wars were rarely decided in a single day. They were decided on the road, far from home, far from farms, far from safety. An army did not simply fight. It moved across mountains, across forests, across lands that did not belong to them. Every step forward pulled them farther away from supplies, from fresh food, from certainty. The longer the march, the heavier the problem became. Weapons could be repaired. Armor could be replaced. But hunger could not be ignored. Food had to survive the journey. It had to endure heat, cold, rain, and time. It had to be carried, shared, and eaten without a kitchen, without fire, sometimes without rest. In wars like these, logistics mattered more than bravery, because an army that cannot eat cannot move. And an army that cannot move will never reach the battlefield. Distance was the enemy no army could see. The farther they marched, the more fragile everything became. Supply lines stretched thin, wagons broke, animals collapsed, and promises of resupply often arrived too late. In foreign lands, soldiers could not rely on markets. They could not rely on the harvest. Sometimes, they could not rely on anything at all. Every decision began to revolve around one question. How long could they keep eating? Because once food failed, discipline followed. Men slowed down. Formations loosened. Morale cracked quietly. Not during battle, but during the march. History remembers victories and defeats, but it rarely remembers the long weeks in between. Weeks of walking, of waiting, of eating whatever could survive another day on the road. This was the hidden war, fought far from the battlefield, and it was here, long before the fighting began, that many armies were already decided. Food was never a simple problem in war. It was not just about having enough of it. It was about whether it could survive the journey. Most food did not. Fresh meat spoiled quickly, especially under the sun, especially without salt, especially when days turned into weeks. Vegetables rotted, fruits bruised, then disappeared. Grain lasted longer, but grain alone was useless. It had to be cooked. It needed fire, water, time, and war rarely allowed any of those. Bread cracked and crumbled as armies marched. What survived the road often turned to mold before it could be eaten. Every option came with a cost. More food meant more weight. More weight meant slower movement. Slower movement meant vulnerability. Food that required preparation slowed the army down. Food that spoiled poisoned it. So rations were cut, portions grew smaller, meals became repetitive, then joyless, then silent. Soldiers stopped eating for comfort. They ate to function. Sometimes they ate standing, sometimes while walking, sometimes while exhausted beyond thought. There were days when hunger was not sharp, but dull and constant, gnawing quietly in the background. And that was the most dangerous kind, because hunger did not only weaken the body, it weakened discipline. Men became impatient. Arguments started over scraps. Orders were followed more slowly. Formations lost their shape, not because soldiers lacked courage, but because they lacked fuel. Commanders understood this problem well. They spoke of supply, of logistics, of planning. But knowing the problem did not solve it. Every campaign raised the same question again. What kind of food could be carried far from home, shared without ceremony, eaten without preparation, and still keep an army alive? Because in war, a meal did not need to be satisfying. It needed to be reliable. Something that would not rot, something that would not demand fire, something that would still be there after weeks on the road. So the search was never for the perfect food. It was for the least fragile one. In the end, food in war was not about taste or tradition or comfort. It was about endurance. About choosing what could last when everything else failed, what could survive heat and cold, rough handling, careless packing, and endless repetition. What could be eaten even when hands were shaking, even when fire was gone, even when time no longer existed. The answer would not be elegant, it would not be celebrated, but it would remain. And in war, remaining was everything. The answer did not arrive with fanfare, did not march at the front of the army. It did not shine. It did not promise comfort. Most soldiers barely noticed it at first. It was small, dense, unremarkable, a block of hard cheese. In a world shaped by war, this was not food meant to be enjoyed. It was food meant to endure. Hard cheese began as something fragile. Milk spoiled easily. It demanded care, time, patience. But once transformed, once pressed, dried, and aged, it became something else entirely. Something stubborn. It did not rot quickly. It did not collapse under heat. It did not demand fire or preparation. It could be cut, broken, shared, and, most importantly, it could be carried. For armies marching far from home, this mattered more than taste. Hard cheese held energy in a compact form. Fat, protein, salt, enough to keep a body moving when strength was fading, enough to quiet hunger without stopping the march. Soldiers did not eat it for pleasure. They ate it slowly, carefully, often with water, sometimes with bread, when bread still existed. More often, alone. It was rationed, measured, divided into smaller and smaller pieces as the days passed. And yet, it remained. Weeks into a campaign, when meat had vanished, when vegetables were a memory, when grain could no longer be cooked, hard cheese was still there, scratched, cracked, harder than before, but still edible. This was its quiet power. It asked for nothing. No fire, no tools, no time. It did not slow the army down. It did not complicate logistics. It survived careless packing, rough handling, and endless repetition. It could be eaten while standing, while walking, even while exhausted beyond thought. In moments when hands shook from fatigue, hard cheese did not fall apart. In nights when fires were forbidden or impossible, it did not demand warmth. In days when time dissolved into dust and footsteps, it remained reliable. Commanders understood its value even if they rarely spoke of it, because victories were not built only on courage. They were built on continuity, on knowing that tomorrow and the day after there would still be something to eat. Hard cheese did not inspire songs. It did not earn praise. No one celebrated it after a victory. No monuments were raised in its name, but it stayed. Through rain and heat, through movement and delay, through long stretches of uncertainty, it became part of the rhythm of war, cut, chewed, endured, and in that endurance, it played its role. Not as a hero, not as a symbol, but as a solution. In war, the most important answers are rarely elegant. They are practical, quiet, unnoticed. Hard cheese was one of those answers. And while history remembers battles and generals and banners, it is often the simplest things, the least fragile ones, that decide whether an army continues forward or quietly falls apart along the road. Survival was never free. Every solution in war carried a price. Hard cheese kept soldiers alive, but it did not make them strong. It did not make them healthy. It did not restore what was slowly taken away. Eating enough was never the same as being nourished. At first, the changes were subtle, almost invisible. A little less strength in the arms, a little more weight in every step. A little longer to recover after a march. Nothing dramatic, nothing worth stopping for. So the army continued. Day after day, the body adapted, not by growing stronger, but by learning how to endure less. Muscle mass slowly faded. Fat reserves disappeared. Faces became sharper, cheekbones more visible, eyes deeper in their sockets. Uniforms loosened, belts were tightened. Energy became something to manage carefully, like a dwindling supply. It was no longer something to spend freely. Every movement was measured, every unnecessary step avoided. Meals were repetitive, predictable, joyless. The same texture, the same taste, the same routine. Hard cheese, sometimes bread, often nothing else. There were no fresh vegetables, no fruit, no balance. What the body required and what the army could provide were no longer the same thing. The body noticed. Chewing became a burden. Teeth ached under constant pressure. Jaws tightened, then stiffened. Gums bled. Small cracks formed in teeth. Pain became familiar, not sharp pain. Not enough to stop movement, just enough to always be there. Stomachs burned quietly. Digestion slowed. Discomfort became routine. The body adjusted by lowering its expectations. Sleep, too, changed. Nights were short. Rest was shallow. Recovery, incomplete. The body no longer rebuilt itself fully. It repaired only what was necessary. Illness moved through camps without warning. Not dramatic sickness. Not fevers that wiped out entire units. Small infections, lingering coughs, weakness that never quite left. Enough to slow men down. Enough to reduce endurance. Enough to matter when every step counted. Marching continued anyway. Fatigue did not arrive all at once. It accumulated. Each day carried the weight of the last. Each mile added pressure to joints already strained. Knees weakened. Ankles swelled. Feet cracked and bled inside worn sandals. Pain became a companion, not an enemy to fight, but something to live with. The body did not collapse. It diminished. That was the true danger. Every day a little less strength, a little less resistance. The soldier still stood, still walked, still obeyed orders, but he did so with less margin, less reserve. Hard cheese kept hunger away. It prevented immediate collapse, but it could not restore what weeks of imbalance had taken. It was never designed to. Its purpose was not health. It was continuity, to keep bodies functioning long enough to reach the next day, to delay failure, to hold the line between movement and collapse. In this state, soldiers did not fight at their strongest. They fought at what remained. They fought with bodies already compromised, already worn, already reduced. When battle finally came, many soldiers arrived not fresh, but spent. Their endurance had been spent long before the first blow was struck. History often records the moment of battle, the clash, the charge, the outcome. It rarely records the weeks before, weeks of walking, of waiting, of surviving on what could last. Weeks in which the body was quietly being negotiated down. Less speed, less strength, less resilience, but still enough to keep going. And that was the unspoken agreement of war. The army did not ask soldiers to thrive. It asked them to last. Hard cheese was part of that bargain. It offered calories, fat, salt, enough to keep muscles moving, enough to keep the mind focused, but not enough to rebuild, not enough to restore balance, not enough to heal. The body accepted this trade because it had no choice. And commanders accepted it because the alternative was worse. An army that could not eat would not move. An army that could not move would not fight. So the cost was paid slowly, quietly, in thinner faces, in slower marches, in weaker bodies, not in a single moment, but across time. By the time the campaign reached its end, many soldiers were no longer the men who had left home. They had been worn down by distance, by repetition, by survival itself, and still they marched. Because in war, survival was never about comfort. It was never about feeling well. It was about lasting just a little longer than everything else. And sometimes that was enough. Everybody has a limit. Not a dramatic one, not a sudden breaking point, but a quiet threshold that cannot be crossed forever. War pushed soldiers toward that line, day by day, mile by mile, meal by meal. Endurance was praised, discipline was enforced, but the human body did not care about orders. It responded only to balance, and balance had long been lost. There came a moment when survival alone was no longer enough. Calories kept movement going, but strength did not return. Rest existed, but recovery did not. The body continued out of habit, out of training, out of fear, but internally it was negotiating its own limits. Reaction slowed, focus blurred. Mistakes appeared, not large ones, small ones. A missed step, a delayed response, a misjudged distance. In war, small mistakes were dangerous. The body compensated by conserving more. Less speed, less power, less resistance. Soldiers became careful, not because they were cautious, but because they had no surplus left. Pain was no longer a warning. It was background noise. Fatigue was no longer temporary. It was constant. At this stage, the difference between standing and falling was minimal. A shorter rest, a heavier load, a colder night. The limit was not crossed all at once. It was approached slowly, silently. Some bodies adapted better than others. Some endured longer, but no one was immune. The human body could survive imbalance for a time, but it could not escape its consequences. When battle arrived, these limits mattered. Soldiers fought with reduced strength, slower reflexes, narrower margins. They fought not with full capacity, but with what remained after endurance had taken its toll. This was the final cost of prolonged survival. Not weakness, but depletion. The body still functioned, still obeyed, but it no longer forgave mistakes. In war, this limit was rarely acknowledged. Commanders planned around movement, supply, terrain. The human limit was assumed, invisible, unspoken, and yet it shaped outcomes as surely as weapons and numbers, because an army does not fail only when it is defeated. It fails when its people reach the point where there is nothing left to give. They continued because stopping was rarely an option. In war, there was no safe place to rest. Behind them was distance, exhaustion, the road already walked. Ahead of them was uncertainty, but also purpose. Turning back did not restore strength. It only delayed collapse. So they moved forward, not because they were fearless, not because they were strong, but because movement itself was survival. Discipline played its role. Formations held men together when individual strength was gone. Routine replaced motivation. Orders replaced choice. You marched because everyone else marched. You ate because the day required it. You endured because stopping meant standing alone. There was also pressure from commanders, from comrades, from the unspoken rule that weakness endangered others. One man slowing down slowed the line. One man collapsing forced another to carry his weight. So men learned to hide pain, to mask fatigue, to remain silent, not out of pride, but out of necessity. Belief mattered too. Not belief in glory, but belief in completion, that the march would end, that the campaign had a limit, that suffering was temporary, even when evidence suggested otherwise. Hope did not need to be realistic. It only needed to exist. Food, like hard cheese, played a quiet role in this. It did not inspire courage, but it removed the sharp edge of hunger. Enough to keep thinking, enough to keep moving, enough to make the next step possible. In war, continuation was rarely heroic. It was mechanical. Step, breath, eat, sleep, repeat. The army moved not as a collection of individuals, but as a system, and systems continue long after parts begin to fail. Only when discipline broke, when routine collapsed, when food disappeared completely, did movement stop. Until then, they continued, not because they wanted to, but because the structure of war left them no other path. War is often remembered through battles, through victories, through names carved into stone. But long before swords met, and long after banners fell, war was sustained by quieter things, by routine, by endurance, by food that did not inspire but endured. Hard cheese did not win wars. It did not change history in a single moment, but it kept armies moving when everything else failed. And sometimes, that was enough to decide everything. If this story changed the way you see war, not as glory, but as survival, take a moment to like this video. It helps this kind of history reach more people. If you have a thought, or a question, or a different perspective, leave a comment below. I read them. And if you want more stories like this, stories about history told from unexpected angles, subscribe to the channel, because history is not only written by those who fought, but by what kept them alive.